All right. Hello again, adventurers, and welcome to another exciting episode of D&D Deep Dive. The show where we dive deep into classes, subclasses, and other features of 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons to help you get the most out of your choices. So, today we are going to be continuing along this theme of homebrewing and kind of the things you need to know in order to start homebrewing by looking at the Druid. Now, years ago, when I first started did a D&D deep dive, the reason I started it was because of two classes. The first one was the monk. In my personal opinion, the monk is the most misunderstood class of the 5th edition because it does something, at least in the player's handbook, that is unique to that class, which is it is an action economy controller. And everything else in the player's handbook generally falls into the kind of holy trinity that we see in like MMOs and that, where you either have people that do damage, you have people that take damage, and you have people that keep people alive. That's basically what every other subclass in there is designed to do. One of those the three things. The monk is not designed to do any of those, and so it was really difficult for a lot of people to understand. The other thing that inspired me was actually a friend of mine. I used to run. I actually used to run the D&D Wednesday night programs, like the not just a single table, but I was in charge of all D&D games that were played on Wednesday nights for actually a couple different local gaming stores that I used to go to back in the before times. And one of my friends had decided that they wanted to play a druid. And as they were going through it, they just kept getting more and more frustrated with the druid because they always felt underpowered and they always felt not as useful. They were a moon druid, and they could, even when they went into their kind of powerful wild shapes, they were getting out damaged by most other classes at the table. They were becoming, they were getting reduced down to 0 hit points a lot quicker because wild shapes generally didn't have really great AC. They just felt really frustrated with the class in general. And so the other thing that kind of inspired me to do a D&D deep dive was the idea that the monk and the druid are probably the two hardest classes to play in the game because the monk, again, does something unique. The druid is built around flexibility more so than almost any other class. Spellcasters in general tend to be a little bit more built around flexibility, just because spells can be so varied in their effects, and you can kind of specialize in a lot of different ways. But the druid especially has a lot of the druid doesn't fit into a specific role. It can fill a lot of different roles. And if you don't understand that, you can play it really poorly by trying to do a little bit of everything and not doing anything really well. You know, jack of all trades, master, none. So, the second class I'm going to cover for this is going to be the druid, because again, it is a super easy class to misunderstand and not quite get what you're doing. And when you don't understand the base class and you don't understand the defining features of the class, well, then you're going to create subclasses and homebrew stuff for the druid that doesn't work because it's going to actively fight against what the class is designed to do. So, let's let's dive into the Druid itself. So, quick reminder on 5th edition Kick Class Design. In 5th edition D&D, every class is designed to play very, very differently right from the beginning. In order to do that, every class has these things that we call defining features. A defining feature is either something that is unique to the class, or maybe it's not unique, but they get it earlier or can do it can use it in a different way than other classes. And in order for something to be a defining feature, it has to show up within the first 2 levels. So, what are the defining features of the Druid? These are, when you are homebrewing, specifically when you're making subclasses, your subclass should affect one of the defining features in some way. If you're creating a subclass that's not going to interact with any of the defining features, I will almost guarantee the subclass is going to be underpowered because you're going to be fighting against the main class. So understanding these is really, really important. So, the Druid itself has 4 different features that it gets within the first 2 levels. One of those being they choose their subclass at level 2 instead of level 3 like most others. So this is another one where the subclass can actually really kind of introduce a defining feature to a point, but it still needs to be linked to something in the subclass. And we'll go into more details about that when we actually talk about the 2 PHB subclasses. But the four things that you get within the first 2 levels are Druidic, which is a special secret language of Druids. You get your Spellcasting, which we'll talk about how that works as a defining feature in just a second here. You get your Wild Shape, which is most definitely a defining feature, and you get that at 2nd level. And then again, you choose your Druid Circle, which is your subclass at 2nd level. So let's start with each one of these things and just talk about how it's a defining feature and really what it brings to the class itself. The first quote-unquote defining feature, but I have a hard time calling it defining feature, not because it isn't unique or it absolutely fits exactly what the definition of defining feature has been for the majority of these episodes. However, this is something that is not mentioned anywhere else in any of the class, in any of the subclasses. This is something that shows up at first level and is just forgotten. And most players don't even know this is a thing. I have a hard time calling it the defining feature just because it never shows up again. But it is an incredibly cool thing, and that is Druidic. Druidic is, the exact wording here is, Druidic, the secret language of Druids. You can speak the language and use it to leave hidden messages. You and others who know this language automatically spot such a message. Others spot the message's presence with a successful DC Wisdom perception check, but can't decipher it without magic. So Druidic is a special language for Druids, and you can only learn it by being a Druid. There's no other way you can learn it. You can't pick it up as another spell. It's kind of similar to Thieves' Cant. If you've watched some of my Rogues videos where I've talked about Thieves' Cant and how cool it is, Druidic is very, very similar to the thing. The difference being, this one is Druid-based. Thieves' Cant is, criminal based. And again, it's something that doesn't show up anywhere else in the class. And I think it's a disservice to the ability. Again, languages are a bit hit or miss in D&D 5th edition in general. In some campaigns, the more languages that you know, the more powerful you are. Especially if you are doing a very kind of high espionage or high roleplay style adventure. Knowing additional languages can be the difference between wandering into an ambush and ambushing them yourselves. Like, it's a really, really useful thing. In other campaigns, it doesn't matter. I know quite a few DMs who have no one in their campaigns at all ever speak anything other than common, which is perfectly fine. Again, this is a fantasy, style thing. How many times do we see in movies and that, all the aliens somehow speak English? It's a suspension of disbelief thing that's meant to just allow you to tell more stories. Or the idea of a universal translator, things like that are just absolutely bonkers in how they work. So your mileage may vary having your own personal language, but if you do actually use it, there's a lot of really fun things that you can do. And again, the cool thing about Druidic is, only people that can that speak Druidic can actually understand the message unless you use some sort of magic spell that gives you the ability to read it. Anyone can spot a Druidic message. So this can be something remarkably useful, because specifically it says, others spot the message presses with a successful DC Wisdom Perception check. So this isn't something that can be passively perceived as like, oh, there's some Druidic there. It's something they have to know to look for. So in a situation where your Druid is the one that is moving forward as your scout, which can happen with Wild Shape, which we'll talk about in a little bit here, they can actually leave messages for your party to find. Now, the party won't be able to understand what the message is, but just being able to see, oh, the Druid pointed out something there. To give you an example, I've been playing a ton of Elden Ring recently, and something that is super, super useful every so often in dungeons and things like that, there will be pressure plates. If you step on them, bad things happen. And if you look for them, they're actually not that difficult to find, but you have to be looking for them. And in a Soulsborne game, you're generally not looking for things on the floor. You're looking for bad things to just pop out from around a corner and kill you in 2 hits. So I step on these things constantly. But something you can do in Souls games is you can put messages on the ground. 90% of these are jokes or things that, they'll go to the edge of a cliff and say, try jumping here to try and make you think that there's a secret down there, and you just jump to your death. But something that happens a lot is you will get these messages, which on screen just show up as these glowing runes on the ground. And what some kind players will do is they will actually, just before the trap, they will put a message, so that instead of the trap mostly blending in with the ground, you can actually see this huge glowing sign. If you get close enough to read it, it says, trap ahead. And you go, oh, maybe I shouldn't step on that. If you use Druidic, like people use messages in Dark Souls and in Elden Ring and things like that, there's some really awesome things that you can do. You can leave effectively invisible breadcrumbs for your party to follow, because the party will look for them. But no one else would know unless they're another Druid or specifically looking for Druidic. No one else would realize that those are messages. And again, it won't matter that your party can't read them. They'll be able to go, oh, look, there's a message there. And just something really, really simple with your party is like, if I make a message on the ground, that means walk here. If I make a message on a tree or something higher up, that means watch out for something here. You could create a very, very simple way for your players to not need to understand what the Druidic message means, just having a marker there. There's so many things you can do with Druidic that players have never done. Don't use it because it's never referenced. That being said, because it's about homebrewing, there is not a single subclass that deals with Druidic at all, that modifies Druidic at all. So if you do want to do something interesting, in the second video of this, I may try brainstorming some ideas about how to make a subclass based around Druidic. Yeah, that would be something that'd be very interesting. So yeah, Druidic, really interesting, kind of a defining feature, but nobody ever uses it. Moving on. The next defining feature they get spellcasting. Spellcasting is not unique to the Druid in any way, shape, or form. Their particular flavor of spellcasting is not really unique to the Druid either. They do spellcasting very similar to divine spellcasting, where every morning when they wake up, they have access to their full spell list and they prepare a number of spells equal to wisdom modifier plus your druid level. And so every morning they get to choose a new list of spells, which is one of the things that can definitely confuse newer players. I'm not a huge fan of new players playing spellcasters as their very, very first D&D experience, because spellcasting is complicated. Does that mean I don't think any brand new player should ever play spellcaster? Absolutely not. I would probably say they shouldn't pick their own spells if they've never played an RPG before. They should not pick their own spells. Pick their spells for them. But it is definitely a higher learning curve than most melee classes, or just most weapon-based classes. So it is a little bit confusing. But it's not horrible. The thing with the druid, again, because even compared to like the cleric, most people consider the cleric the healer, and so they think that most of their spells are going to involve healing and protecting and the things like that, which you can build a cleric around those spells. And they have those spells available to them, and they're very, very cool and interesting. Clerics can also be just holy divine smiters. Like, they can just go into a room and go, oh, there are bad guys here? How would you like a pilum of radiant fire? Or, hey, have you met my friend's spiritual weapon? He's going to beat the living shit out of you over and over and over again while I sit back and drink my mojito. There are a lot of really, really cool things that clerics can do. Druids are even more kind of just bizarre, because they have so many other things that they can do with their spells. Because they're more nature-based, they're going to have some control aspects, and understanding the different things that you can do with your spells and understanding where you fit within the party is really essential when you're picking your spells. One of the things I have not done on D&D Deep Dive is I've not done a deep dive into spells in 5th edition, because, oh dear God, there are tons of them. And I'm not sure how interesting I could make a series where I would just go through all the different spell lists and the things like that. Despite the fact that I think that would be really, really useful. We are talking about probably longer than my Final Fantasy XIV sub-series. I mean, we're talking about months and months and months of me doing nothing but talking about spells. There's that many spells in this game. So I haven't done that specifically, but to talk about the Druid, we do have to touch on some of those the things. Because, again, there's so many different things that a Druid can do that a lot of people won't think of. Like, a really good example. This is one that actually showed up in the Elemental Evil Player's Companion, which was a godsend for Druids. The Elemental Evil Player's Companion came out with, I can't remember what the adventure was called now. Hold, please. Sources, what was it called? Prince of the Apocalypse. There we go. Prince of the Apocalypse was basically a retelling of the Temple of Elemental Evil, which was an original D&D adventure. It is a phenomenal D&D adventure. It is really, really brilliant. It's an entire campaign. You explore this evil temple that has 4 different wings that each has a different elemental cult in it. You have to deal, like, it is such a cool adventure. Prince of the Apocalypse is interesting. I don't think it quite lives up to the Temple of Elemental Evil, but it's a pretty good adventure series. But one of the things it did is it added a bunch of elemental spells to kind of fit with the theme, and Earth Tremor is one of them, just a first level spell. And just about everyone gets access to this, so this is not a uniquely Druid thing. But it's something that Druids can use that I think fits the Druid kit better than most other Giga kits. So specifically, it can be used for bards, druids, sorcerers, and wizards. All four of those classes get this on their spell list. So this basically the only spellcaster that has the ability to pick this every morning is the druid. Everyone else learns their spells. Bards and sorcerers learn their spells. Wizards have a spell book. So theoretically, wizards might be able to do this, but they have to pick this as a spell that they learn. Druids just always have access to this spell. They just have to prepare it every day. So it does make a little difference. But the thing with Earth Tremor is, it is, I have to look at this. Oh yeah, so it's basically everything within 10 feet of you. So basically a 20-foot circle around you. Each creature other than you in the area must make a dex save throw. On a failed save, they take a d6 of bludgeoning damage and is knocked prone. Or the correct grammar for what I would say is are knocked prone, but that's what it says. I was reading it because it's singular and I was talking plural. If the ground in that area is loose earth or stone, it becomes difficult terrain until cleared, with each 5-foot diameter portion requiring at least 1 minute to clear by hand. So there's a lot to unpack about this spell. But the big thing about it is a d6 of bludgeoning damage is nothing. For a first level spell, that's really, really underpowered. This is not a spell that is meant to be used for damage. However, knocking a bunch of targets prone is a big deal. That's a remarkably large area to do that in. And creating difficult terrain is really useful, especially as you get to higher levels of the Druid where they're no longer affected by difficult terrain created by magic or natural things. Specifically, or maybe that's not a Druid thing. I know Rangers have that ability. But again, with wild shape and the things like that, Druids can get out of a lot of situations but pretty easily. So anyway, Earth Tremor, it kind of really encapsulates how the Druid is meant to be played. If you pick Earth Tremor, a lot of people are going to say, well, this is a pointless spell. It does barely any damage. Yeah, but it does two things that are really, really useful, especially when combined together. It knocks targets prone. Prone is a really, really useful condition because any melee attacks made against them are made with advantage. So that's a action economy control thing. It's really, really useful. Any attacks the target makes while prone are made with disadvantage. So using this and then piecing out is actually really useful because anyone that tries to take an opportunity attack against you is going to make that opportunity attack at disadvantage, meaning significantly more likely for you to get out unscathed. So those two things in and of themselves are not bad, and something a lot of people don't tend to use, and I don't understand why. Druids can use shields. So they can wear up to medium armor and they can use shields. So they can have a remarkably high armor class when they want to. Using Earth Tremor isn't nearly as bad. Like a lot of people go, well, you have to like run into the enemies and then you'll get a bunch of opportunity attacks. It's not that big a deal for Druids, but when you look at what happens, if you are prone, you have to spend half of your movement to stand up. Most creatures, especially creatures you're going to deal with at first level, are only going to have 30 feet of movement. Some may have up to 40 feet, but 30 feet is kind of the gold standard. Your humanoid monsters... Sorry, I set on my glasses. Your humanoid monsters are all going to have 35 feet of movement at this level. So what happens is you have to use half your movement. So that's 15 feet of movement. You only have 15 left. The way that difficult terrain works is in order to enter a square of difficult terrain, you have to have enough movement to enter that, or any to do any movement in 5th edition if you're using a map. In order to enter that area, you have to have enough movement to move into that area. With difficult terrain, it costs you twice as much movement. So for each square, it costs 5 feet of movement. You only have 15 feet of movement. So by knocking them prone and creating difficult terrain, yes, they only have to spend half their movement to stand up, but they can only move one space forward. So you have changed their movement of 30 into effectively a movement of 5 feet. Because if they move into the first square, that takes 10 feet of movement. It gives them 5 left. They don't have enough movement to move into a second square. And that's where Earth Tremor goes from, wow, this is a really dumb spell, I don't understand why anyone ever would use it, into, oh, this is remarkably useful, especially for a first level spell, because this can create a pretty large area. Again, it's a 20-foot in diameter circle. So if you place it in the right place, you could effectively bottleneck a really large opening, which would prevent characters from getting close enough to really do much of anything. This is not a concentration spell. And the spell effect the difficult terrain doesn't go away after a minute or something like that. The difficult terrain doesn't go away until it is cleared by hand. So this is something that could be used repeatedly to effectively make a very large area, which is all difficult terrain. Now, it only works on loose earth or stone, so it is very situational, but in those situations, which there are a lot of situations where that will be useful. Loose earth and stone are very, very common things. Like anytime you're fighting in a forest, you're on loose earth. Most like mausoleums and stuff like that, the ground is stone. So there's a lot of situations where this could be useful, and it really kind of emphasizes how Druid spellcasting works just in general. Despite the fact this is not exclusively a Druid spell, these are the things that you need to think about when you're picking your spells as a Druid. Is what is going to help me the most. If you are a Moon Druid, you are still a full spellcaster, despite the fact that Wild Shape is your thing. Picking spells like Fairy Fire can be massively useful. You cast Fairy Fire, and then you turn into a T-Rex, and you get advantage on all your chomping attacks. Those are really, really good combos. Doing Earth to Tremor and turning into a flying creature, which you can't do at first level, but you can eventually do it as you get higher, gives you the ability to fly over difficult terrain without being affected by it, while the enemies are affected by it. And thank you, phone. And again, this spell or Wild Shape is a bonus action, so you can use this spell and then Wild Shape in the same turn. Or if you need to make a slightly larger area, use this spell, bonus action, something else the next turn, move to another area, use the spell again, then Wild Shape. Like there's a ton of different things that you can do with this spell to just be really, really effective. And that is how you need to play your Druid. Is you need to look at your spells not so much as, okay, what specifically do they do, but look at the spells and how they're going to interact with the other things that you do. Again, Fairy Fire is going to be very, very useful. Entangle can be remarkably useful, and it is an exclusively Druid spell. There's just so many different things that the Druid has that can be very interesting and very useful, but you have to really look and choose your spells. And again, choose your spells based on what you are. If you are, if you are, I'm trying to think of a situation where this 100%. If you are on a ship, and you're going to be on a ship, don't take Earth Tremor, because the ship is not going to be affected by most of the useful aspects of Earth Tremor. You're not going to be able to create your difficult terrain. The prone thing is still going to be useful. but don't pick Earth Tremor that day. You know, pick things that are going to fit with your thing. So, yeah. Sorry, I had to go on that little tangent because, again, I'm not going to go through every single spell. I may do that one day. If you guys want me to do a series on spells where I go through every spell in the darn Giga game, put it in the comments below. I don't know how or when that'll happen, but at least knowing people are interested, I can eventually maybe make it happen. So anyway, that is spellcasting for the Druid. Again, it's not unique to the Druid, but how you use it is very, very unique, especially when we go to the next defining feature. The next defining feature is Wild Shape. And this is something that has become definitive of Druids just in the wider mythos. When you look at Druids, like the first Druid I ever played, the first character I ever played in any, well, not any MMO. I played EverQuest, and I think it was a ranger in that at first. And then I can't remember what the class is called, but it summoned elementals, and I liked that. Eventually, I started playing World of Warcraft, which is the first MMO that I played, like, religiously. And my first character ever was a Druid. And the thing I liked about the Druid is it could transform into a bunch of different animals. When you look at Druids just in general, across kind of RPGs in general, the ability to change into animal forms has been something that has really been definitive of the Druid for a while. Certain flavors of Druid could do it into the 3rd edition. I believe the Druid in 2nd edition had abilities. They weren't quite as customizable as Wild Shape is, but it's been something that has existed for decades for the Druid. Wild Shape is interesting because the base version of Wild Shape is not nearly as useful as what a lot of people consider Wild Shape to be. Because for Wild Shape, when you get it at 2nd level, the max challenge rating you can turn into is a 1/4 creature, and it cannot have a flying speed or a swimming speed. And creatures that level simply are just not useful in combat. They're generally only useful when you have a lot of them. So Wild Shape in general for a Druid that is not a Moon Druid is not a combat ability, but it is an incredibly useful ability. And I mentioned it before. If you combine it with other spells, even if you are not a Moon Druid that's meant to be, doing a lot of really, turning into beasts and attacking with them. In combat, because for most Druids, I just realized that for regular Druids, it's an action to do that, not a bonus action. I spoke incorrectly. I believe for the Moon Druid, it's a bonus action. So anyway, there are situations where it's very, very useful. And again, when you're not in combat, which technically is supposed to be 2/3 of there are 3 pillars of D&D. Exploration, role-playing, and then combat. For 2 of the 3, Wild Shape is remarkably useful. For all Druids, and then for 1 subclass, it's very, very useful in combat. So yeah, understanding your Wild Shape and understanding the things that you can do. One of the things that I had to really emphasize to my friend is when you are choosing your Wild Shapes, don't always just look for what creature has the highest damage dice, because a lot of times creatures in general, Wild Shape is limited to beasts, and you're not going to be able to use legendary creatures. So in general, these are things that are designed to be used with other creatures. They're not generally that powerful on their own. So if you're looking to do a crap ton of damage in your Wild Shape, you're generally not going to be able to do that very often. Even as a Moon Druid, you're not going to be a massive damage dealer just by using your Wild Shape. Combine it with some spells, you can do some cool stuff. However, there are a lot of really interesting beasts that you can turn into. Things like a giant constrictor snake. Giant constrictor snakes, when they attack a creature, they get an auto grapple which restrains. Grapple is useful mostly because it stops them from moving. Restrained is significantly more useful. All attacks against them have advantage. All attacks they make have disadvantage, and strength and dexterity saving throws are made with disadvantage. Restrained is a remarkably useful ability, and the constrictor snake gets it by making an attack roll. There's no contested check. You just make an attack roll, you hit with it, and then you get to do that. Scorpions are another one that auto-grapple. If they hit you, they auto-grapple. There's quite a few different creatures that have this ability where if they hit you, they will automatically grapple you, and that can be incredibly useful. So you need to look at the entirety of the kit of the creatures. Things like, I think it's tigers. Tigers have this ability where if they move at least 10 feet before they attack, they can pounce. Where the creature makes a strength save, they fail the strength save, they get knocked prone, and you get an extra attack because of that. You know, you really need to look not just, okay, what damage dice does my creature do? And this applies to all wild shapes just in general, not just combat wild shape for moon druids. Look at the entirety of the monster stat blocks that you have available to you and figure out which one is going to give you the most benefit. Things like owls have dark vision. It's incredibly useful. You can't get anything with a flying speed until 8th level, but still, 8th level is not a massively high level. And there's a good chance that you could get to, depending on how often you play, you could easily get a character from 1st to 8th level in like 6 months of regular play. So I mean, it's not outside the question that you can definitely get a flying creature that you can use at night to scout around and do all these other things. Like, there's a lot of different things, but that's what you need to focus on with wild shape. And when you start modifying it, those are the things that you have to think about, is the whole kit itself. So yeah, that is wild shape. And then finally, the Druid circles, like I said, they can kind of introduce some defining features. We're going to look at the 2 circles that are shown in the player's handbook, just to give you an idea of how they modify things. And just like the monk, there's really 2 defining features that ever get anything to modify them for the druid. It's either the spellcasting or it's their wild shape. And just like the monk, where you have each defining feature has a specific subclass that focuses exclusively on it, that's what you have with the druid here. Circle of the Land is going to focus entirely on spellcasting. Circle of the Moon is going to focus entirely on your wild shape. So let's look at that. We're going to start with the Circle of the Land. So, Circle of the Land, again, is your spellcasting subclass. And the first thing that it gives you right at 2nd level is it increases your spellcasting just in general. You get bonus cantrip, you get an additional cantrip. Cantrips are always just as useful. And then you also get natural recovery, which is basically the druid version of arcane recovery, which is a wizard defining feature. Basically, during a short rest, you can get spell slots back. You have a limited number of them you can get back, but it gives you spell slots back. This, again, as looking at it as modifying a defining feature, this modifies your spellcasting feature by literally giving you more spells. You can cast more often. You are incentivized to use a lot more spells with this than any other subclass. You are literally, they're literally saying, go crazy with casting. You can do more. So, when you're looking at modifying defining features, and this is something that we will see in a lot of different classes, is spellcasting is a defining feature for them, or spellcasting is a feature for them. So Modifying it means you have to understand how spellcasting is going to work for them. And in this particular instance, it means that they can use spell slots on things like Earth Tremor without feeling like, well, if I use this spell slot for Earth Tremor, that means that I can't cast something more powerful. You know, I can't use another first level spell for this is something else. You know, I'm using up a spell slot I did, and is it the best use of that spell slot? Well, they get more spell slots in other classes, so they can do things that other classes normally wouldn't because they just have more spell slots. So that is something that you can do. Now, from a homebrew perspective, again, Arcane Recovery is a defining feature of the wizard. Giving it to other classes via a subclass is going to start infringing on what makes the wizard special. So make sure when you do this that you're not giving it to something like a sorcerer. A sorcerer is meant to be different than a wizard, and giving them the same abilities as the wizard really kind of defeats the purposes of both classes. Again, the druid is different enough, and their spell selection is different enough that giving them basically the same ability is not going to take away that much from the wizard, because the wizard uses their spells very, very differently than how the druid is going to. So keep that in mind when you're homebrewing, is when I'm adding something, especially if you are taking a feature that already exists into the D&D and giving it to a class that normally doesn't give it, think about how is it going to affect this class, obviously, but how is it going to affect the class that this is no longer unique to? Is it going to be something is like, well, now I don't even need to multi-class into that particular class. I can just I can just go I can just go with this as a subclass instead of having to multi-class. Anytime you do something that means that someone no longer has to multi-class in order to do something, you have to really worry about balance, because multi-classing is a balancing feature. And if you can do the exact same thing without multi-classing, then you have just trivialized a balancing feature of this. It's kind of like taking away concentration or allowing you to exchange bonus actions for actions. It massively changes how the game is played. So understand, when you are doing something like this, consider, is this going to trivialize another class, because that's going to unbalance the game. Like I said before, this doesn't really do that, because how they use their spells are so massively different that you can give them an ability that's supposed to be a wizard defining feature without the wizard feeling like, no, I don't need to be a wizard. It's also tied to their druid level, so if you only go 2 levels into druid to take this, you will only ever be able to recover a single level of spell slots. Whereas if you continue being a druid and keep leveling up, you eventually can get all the way up to 6th level spell slots back from this. Or 5th level spell slots, sorry, not 6th level. Can't be 6th level or higher. So, that being said, moving on to the next thing is the other thing that tends to be really, really common for subclasses in general for spellcasters, is to modify the spellcasting ability by just expanding their spell list. And this is something that I think the Circle of the Land Druid does super, super well, because you specifically choose a type of land that you are tied to, and that type of land gives you a list of spells. The thing with circle spells compared to some other spell lists, these are spells that you always have prepared. They don't count against the number of spells you have prepared. So these are just extra spells that you always have access to all the time. No preparation needed. And in the player's handbook, I believe they had all the ones that I'm looking at here. I might be wrong. They might have extra ones in here, because I'm looking at D&D Beyond, and they like to kind of push everything together. Though that might be an optional class features too. But anyway, it looks like they've got Arctic, Coast, Desert, Forest, Grassland, Mountain, Swamp, and Underdark are the ones that are listed here. I can't remember if all of those are in the player's handbook, but they all sound familiar to me. Each one has a different thing. And And they do different things. Like Arctic gives you spike growth. Spike growth is a second level ability that can be remarkably useful. Basically, it turns an area into difficult terrain. We've already talked about how that can be very, very useful. But for every 5 foot a creature moves in that area, they take 2d4 piercing damage. And it can be disguised so that it looks like normal terrain. So there's a good chance that your enemies won't know that they are in that they're about to run into an area of not only difficult terrain, but difficult terrain that hurts them until they're already in it. Or it's a 20-foot radius sphere. So that's a 40-foot area. If you drop that on a character, that means they have to, like if you drop it directly on them when they're at the center, that means they have to move a minimum of 20 feet to get out of it, which again, each 5 feet costs them 10 feet of movement. So there's a good chance it'll take them 2 turns to get out of that area. And if you place it in between you and the bad guys, they might have to go the full 40 feet to get across it. And again, for every 5 feet, that's 4 times for 20 feet, or 8 times for 40 feet. They're going to take piercing damage. 2d4 is not a lot until you get until you turn it into 16 d4. Then it starts turning into something that is annoying and can cause lots of issues. So, yeah. So that's just the Arctic thing. And when you look at all these different things, there's a lot of different really useful things. Like Desert gets Blur. Blur is a massively useful ability. And again, when you're looking at, excuse me, when you're looking at modifying a defining feature like spellcasting, adding to the spell list, first of all, is a double-edged sword. You need to understand what the class is designed to do. You need to understand what expanding the spell list means. For Druids, it means they always have these spells available. For things like Warlocks, it means that they now have access to these spells. They can learn them. They don't always have them learned or memorized or whatever like that. So understand the difference of, an expanded spell list versus something like circle spells, which is just extra spells they always have access to, and understand giving them access to spells that normally wouldn't be on their spell list can massively change how the class is played. So understand, look at where the spell normally shows up. If this is a wizard spell, is it going to massively unbalance the game by giving it to a druid? Again, you never want a subclass to make another class feel like it's useless now, because not only can the druid cast all the spells that the wizard can cast, and now they also have the arcane recovery, which is a big defining feature of the wizard, but they also have the ability to wild shape whenever they want, so they can do all these really cool things like flying away or doing all these other things without having to worry about being a wizard. And they can use shields, and wizards can't do that, and they can wear armor, and wizards can't do that. Again, you don't want to make a class pointless by giving their abilities away to another class. Understand that when you're doing that. However, these spell lists can be massively, massively useful. Especially in the idea of the druid, where these are just spells that they always have prepared. You can give them access to spells they already have on their spell list, just so they don't have to prepare them. Doing the things like that can really help the druid to feel even more kind of customizable and able to fit in any situation, because the stuff that really fits with their theme, that really fits with the class, you can put those in, or the subclass you're trying to build, you can put those into an expanded spell list, and then they just always have those available to them, and then they can choose other spells they normally wouldn't prepare, simply because they want to make sure they have access to these spells. That's a really effective way to modify the spellcasting defining feature. And Again, the Circle of the Land is exclusively spellcasting. It doesn't do anything else other than spellcasting for the most part. Um, so, if you're creating a subclass for the Druid, starting off with an expanded spell list that leans into the features that you're going to be modifying of the Druid later on, maybe introducing a different defining feature or something, and the additional spells you give all interact with that feature really well, that can be a really great way to kind of augment and incentivize them to use the features the way you want them to be used. So never underestimate how useful an expanded spell list or circle spells, things like that, can be. So moving on, that's where I knew this happened. 6th level to get Landstride. Moving through non-magical difficult terrain costs you no extra movement. You can also pass through non-magical plants without being slowed by them, without taking damage from them if they have thorns, blah blah. And then you have advantage on saving throws against plants that are magically. So this isn't like the Ranger one where you're just not affected by natural stuff. But it does have some things. It wouldn't work on Earth Tremor because that's magically create. Well, actually, technically, difficult terrain. And this would be something you'd have to talk about with your DM. I would rule that because it is not a concentration effect, it's literally Earth Tremor causes the ground to be damaged. I would call that non-magical difficult terrain because while it was caused by a magic spell, that would kind of be like, using produce flame to set a house on fire. Would not mean that someone inside the house that's immune to magical fire would be immune to their house burning down. Just because it was started by magic, the rest of the fire is real fire. So I would almost say that this should work with Earth Tremor, but it wouldn't work with something like Spike Growth, because Spike Growth is a concentration spell. It only exists as long as the spell casts. So take that for what it is. But anyway, so again, Landstride itself doesn't really modify spellcasting. It doesn't modify wild shape, but it is something that gives you more versatility in your ability to cast spells. The ability to get to places that other characters couldn't. Like if there are, if there is an area where there's a lot of, spikes or like you're going through an evil forest and there's all these, poisonous spiked plants and things like that, you could literally wander into the middle of them and be perfectly fine, where any enemy trying to get to you would have to take a significant amount of damage, and you can just nuke them from in there. So while yes, Landstride doesn't seem like it affects your spellcasting, giving you additional movement and additional ways to move is always going to affect your ability to cast spells in general. Because it allows you to cast them from a more advantageous position than you would have been able to without this ability. So understand when you start messing with movement, and that applies to melee attacks and weapon attacks as well. Anytime you modify movement in general, it's going to change how you play the character. And it can be a very effective way without massively breaking the game, just by giving them the ability to do things like move over difficult terrain, or climb up walls easier. Things like that can massively change how the character plays and fit into other things that you're doing with this as a subclass. So movement is a remarkably useful, movement speeds and things like that are a remarkably useful thing that you can add to a subclass to really kind of customize how you want the subclass to play, simply by allowing them to get into positions they normally couldn't to take advantage of cool subclass abilities. Nature's Ward, you can't be charmed or frightened by elementals or fey, and you're immune to poison and disease. Again, this is another thing that seems like, well, that's nothing to do with spellcasting. It's anti-spellcasting, because a lot of things that would cause you to be charmed or frightened by elementals are fays. There are a lot of fey, specifically fey, that use magic a ton. Some fey do have just abilities that allow them to do that, but a lot of them use spells to do it as well. Elementals, not quite as much. Those tend to be just abilities. But again, these are other things that are just kind of improving your ability to only use your spells in the way that you want to. Again, on its own, it doesn't really seem like it modifies the spellcasting. However, when you look at it with everything else in the class, you can see, okay, this is allowing me to really, really make sure that I'm using my abilities the way that I want to. Especially with the charmed condition. The charmed condition itself generally is not that powerful. Basically, a charmed creature can't attack the charmer or target the charmer with harmful abilities or magical effects, and the charmer has advantage on ability checks to interact socially with the creature. It's not that incredible a condition. However, especially with Fae, a lot of times if they have an ability that allows them to charm a creature, that charm comes with additional things. They will add on additional effects to the charm that make them really bad, some of which gives them almost complete control over your character. So the ability to resist charm and frighten effectively means that you're able to cast your spells exactly where you want to, all the time, and not have to worry. Again, just from the charmed effect, you would not be able to cast Spike Growth, to use that spell again. You would not be able to cast that on any area that contained the creature that had charmed you. And so they could use that to make sure you effectively couldn't cast the spell anywhere it could be useful, because they would just make sure that that creature is where is in an area where they don't want the thorns to show up or the spike growth to show up. So yeah, this again, when you look at how everything else interacts, and this is another thing that can be really useful when you're homebrewing, is you look at what you're going to be doing and things that will stop the player from being able to use the subclass the way that you want. By making them immune to it or giving them advantage to it, it means that they can play almost more recklessly in situations where other characters would have to go, no, I can't do that because I might have to worry about this or this or this. Or I'm going to specifically, when I build my character, I'm going to put specific points into certain places to avoid having to deal with the things like that. And then finally, at 14th level, they get Nature's Sanctuary, which is basically, it is a permanent sanctuary spell against beast and plant creatures. And again, at first it doesn't sound like it. It doesn't sound that good, but when you look at actually what it does, specifically, when a beast or plant creature attacks you, the creature must make a wisdom save throw against your Druid spell save DC. On a failed save, the creature must use a different target, or the attack automatically misses. On a successful save, the creature is immune to this effect for 24 hours, and the creature is aware of this effect before it makes its attack against you. So, Sanctuary is kind of a useful spell for the beginning of combat, because basically what it does is anyone that tries to make an attack against you has to make a wisdom save, and on a failed save, they don't make the attack. However, Sanctuary ends as soon as you do something aggressive. Nature's Sanctuary doesn't. You can call down a firestorm on beast or plant creatures, and they will still have to make a wisdom save to hit you. So again, when we look at how everything else in this subclass works, this is again meant to make it so you can cast the spells that you want when you want them to. And this is also a concentration to check limiter. Effectively, most of your really, really powerful spells are going to have concentration built into them. And if you're fighting beast or plant creatures, them being able to get attacks on you will make you make concentration checks, and you will eventually fail. It's how it works. It's how statistics works. Eventually you will roll low. This does allow you, again, it just improves your ability to cast the spells when you want, where you want, and use the spells that you want. So when you look at this, as far as actually physically modifying the spellcasting ability, that happens in the first 3 levels. By 3rd level, you have gotten your circle spells, and 2nd level, you get natural recovery. So literally just 2 levels is all the modification to the spellcasting ability itself. Everything else about this modifies where you cast the spells, what kind of spells can prevent you from spellcasting, and dealing with things that are going to stop you from casting spells. So they all relate back to spellcasting, but again, reading them individually without looking at it in the whole context of the subclass, you're not going to get that. So that's a really important thing when you're thinking about subclassing or homebrewing for any class, but especially for the Druid, is just because you're going, okay, I'm going to focus on the spellcasting feature. I want them to be a different kind of spellcaster. You don't have to always just give them more things that do spells. Giving them the ability to cast spells more often, or being able to give them the ability to cast spells from places they normally couldn't, or preventing them from losing concentration in certain situations can be just as useful as just pumping up their spellcasting. So, that being said, moving on to the Circle of the Moon. This one is a little bit more straightforward. It 100% just modifies the Moon Druid, specifically Wild Shape. It's all it does. So the first thing you get at second level is Combat Wild Shape, which lets you use Wild Shape as a bonus action. And then while you're transformed by Wild Shape, you can use a bonus action to expend a spell slot to regain 1d8 hit points per level of the spell slot expended. So, Combat Wild Shape, as much as people think all it does is deal with Wild Shape, this actually modifies your spellcasting ability by giving you a different way to use a limited resource. And this is another thing that we'll see when we actually do cover the non-PHP subclasses. This is something that can be incredibly useful for building a new subclass. When you're homebrewing anything, taking a limited resource that already exists and allowing a class to use it in a different way is remarkably useful. In this particular instance, spell slots turn into healing, and they are a bonus action. You can bonus action heal yourself, and it's a decent amount of health. A first level spell slot is only going to give you a d8. It's really not that great. But Druids are full spellcasters, and when you are a Moon Druid, you're not going to be casting spells while you're in your Wild Shape. So using a 4th or a 5th level spell slot to just instantly give you 4 or 5 d8 hit points is really useful, and you get a fair amount of spell slots. Again, being a full caster, you get a lot of things, and some of these Wild Shapes are remarkably useful, and they're just additional hit points. The cool thing about Wild Shape is the hit points that you have in Wild Shape, you have to go through all of them, and then it gets to your Druid hit points. So you become a hit point sponge really, really quickly. In addition to Combat Wild Shape, you get Circle Forms, which allows you to use higher challenge rating monsters, and do a lot of other really, really cool, fun things. Starting at 6th level, you can transform into beasts with a challenge rating as high as your Druid level divided by 3, rounded down. So going up to the highest you can get to at level 18, you can get up to challenge rating 6 monsters, which are beasts of monsters. Pun intended, obviously. If you actually look at beasts up to challenge rating, like challenge rating 6 beasts. I'm actually going to bring it up here just to give you some ideas. Is there really only one challenge rating 6 beast? Wow. The only thing that exists currently, at least on D&D Beyond, is a mammoth. But it's a mammoth. It has things like Trampling Charge. If the mammoth moves at least 20 feet straight towards a creature and then hits it with a gore attack on the same turn, the target must succeed on a DC 18 strength saving throw or be knocked prone. If the target is prone, the mammoth can make one stomp attack against it as a bonus action. So gore does 25 damage, or 48 plus 7 damage, and stomp does 29 damage. And the thing with Trampling Charge is if the creature is already prone for whatever reason, they just need to move the 20 feet and hit it with a gore attack. they don't need to make sure it fails the saving throw because it's already knocked prone. So yeah, you get 2 attacks, and that is the only challenge rating 5 beast. I am really surprised, or challenge rating 6. However, challenge rating 5 beasts are a lot. A Triceratops is a challenge rating 5 beast, which actually has a very similar thing to a mammoth, just slightly different. Or Obliteros is a beast from Waterdeep Dragon Heist. Large subterranean lizard is from Against the Giants. And it's got stuff that knocks target prone, and it has a bite that has an auto grapple and restrains. So yeah, I mean, there are so many useful things that you can use, and these are challenge rating 5 and 6 creatures. So yeah, Circle Forms, again, modifying the creatures that you can turn into as a druid is a pretty useful thing you can do for a Circle of the Moon druid. Now, understand, if you're changing the creatures you can change into, you need to understand the possible creatures they might turn into. If you go, well, yeah, you can turn into dragons. Let's say dragons is going to be your subclass. Understand exactly what that means. The easiest way I do it is I go to D&D Beyond, and you can actually limit creatures by challenge rating. And if you look at challenge rating 5 and 6 dragons, they have access to young brass dragon, young white dragon, young deep dragon, and a wyvern. So if you give them, if the entirety of your subclass is, well, I'm going to make it kind of like the Circle of the Moon Druid, but it's going to be dragon based, so it's going to have a similar progression as far as challenge ratings are concerned. You have to understand, you are eventually giving them access to a wyvern, which is a remarkably powerful creature. So understand, if you're going to be modifying wild shape by giving them more things that they can change into, or different things they can change into, understand exactly what that means. Sometimes you can limit it by simply saying, okay, I'm going to give you a specific type of creature you can turn into instead of a like genre of creature, an actual creature type. A specific creature you can turn into, or a specific list of creatures you can turn into, can be a really easy way to do that. Another thing you can do is, well, you can now turn into creatures with the dragon subtype. However, you cannot turn into these particular ones, and create lore reasons for that. So there are a lot of different ways to balance that when you're homebrewing and specifically modifying the wild shape of a feature, and it can be a really fun way to do it. Is giving them different ways to do that. Just understand, when you do that, you need to look at everything that exists and everything that can exist. When a new supplement comes out, you'll need to review your subclass if you just give them a new creature type that they can turn into, because it might be that certain aspects of that creature type interact with other aspects of the subclass that you created in ways that you didn't want them to. And you may have to change things and errata things in order to deal with new things, or specifically limit them. You can turn into any creature of this type that exists in these particular supplements. There's a lot of different ways to do it. Just understand limiting is useful. 6th level, they get Primal Strike. This is just how everything works. Attacks when you're transformed count as magical. Because you can't use magic weapons, this is necessary. If you are going to give them additional transformations, you need to have Primal Strike in there if you're homebrewing. And then at 10th level, you get probably the thing that is most interesting, which is Elemental Wild Shape. And this is a perfect example of, okay, I'm not going to give you a brand new type. I'm going to give you a list of creatures that you can turn into. You can turn into an Air Elemental, Earth Elemental, Fire Elemental, or Water Elemental. All of these have massively useful aspects beyond, oh, I do more damage. Air elementals have a fly speed of 90 feet. Earth elementals have a burrow speed, meaning they can go underground and travel through the ground. Fire elementals, if I remember correctly, fire elemental does damage to creatures anytime they attack there. And they can enter a hostile creature space and just live there for a little bit. And then water elementals have a swim speed. Yeah, that's the big thing. There's also a bunch of condition immunities that you get with a bunch of these forms, like the water elemental specifically. Can't be exhausted, can't be grappled, paralyzed, petrified, poisoned, prone, restrained, or unconscious. That is really, really, really useful, especially if you're dealing with something that's what is it? There's a demon that I can't remember. It's a mosquito is what I could call it. But it has this buzzing thing. And it can paralyze you, which is really, really bad because it's a single fail and you are paralyzed for a minute. You can keep making your checks at the end of every turn, but it is remarkably bad for this creature. Dealing with that is as simple as, I'm going to turn into a water elemental, and now I'm immune to the paralyzed and unconscious condition. If I'm dealing with creatures that can petrify, turning into a water elemental, I'm immune to the petrified condition. These are things that you need to focus on when you're doing things. And if you are homebrewing and you're giving them different things that they can do, understand. All these creatures, by the way, are challenge rating 5 creatures, which is 10th level. You can actually transform into challenge rating 5 creatures. You don't get that until you get to 15th level. So this is upping the power, and because of that, it takes 2 uses of wild shape instead of 1. That's another thing that you can do is you can give them more powerful forms, but you can make it cost both their use of wild shape instead of a single use. And this is, again, a really, really effective way to create a very unique version of you can create some really interesting Druid subclasses by simply giving them the ability to transfer into things they normally couldn't, and then giving some other aspects, other features of the subclass that kind of interact with some of the abilities that you've given them. Things like if you wanted to create like an undead druid, by allowing them to turn into undead creatures. You would want to limit what they can do, but as you go up, doing things that increase necrotic damage or add necrotic damage on certain things would fit with that theme, or things that are triggered when you do necrotic damage, like the ability to heal yourself for an amount equal to necrotic damage that you deal. Could be something that would be really, really interesting. And you would have to make sure that you put some limits and things in there, because there are certain undead creatures that do crap tons of necrotic damage, and they would become almost invincible. Yes. Finally, 14th level, you get 1,000 forms. They can cast Alter Self spell, which is a 2nd level spell and can be remarkably useful. I think compared to Elemental Wild Shape, this is a really lame 14th level of ability. And that's another thing that you need to understand when you're homebrewing is when you are creating your abilities, you need to look at the class and you need to look at where your abilities are going to show up within the class itself. If you look at the base class, at 18th level, you get base spells where you can cast spells where you're in Wild Shape. So when you look at this, at 18th level, you could turn into an elemental to get all the benefits of the additional health, the additional things, and then also be able to cast spells while in that. That can really, really change things. Like an earth elemental that can also cast, they can also use that earth tremor, which is just a 1st level spell, but they can go to a place, tremor it, burrow down, and out so that they're not going to be damaged by anything, and they can just pop up an earth tremor wherever they want and create this entire field of really difficult terrain that they can just go through willy-nilly and blast people. You know, again, understand what the rest of the class is doing and how it's going to interact with your subclass is really, really important. And every single time you get a new subclass ability in your homebrew, it needs to feel better than the last one. Elemental Wild Shape is really, really useful. 1,000 Forms, not as useful. Alter Self, you know, casting a second level spell at will is really fun. But if you compare it, like, spectacle wise to Elemental Wide Shape, it's just not going to feel as good. If you combine it with Elemental Wild Shape, which you can at 18th level, that might turn into something more interesting. Or even just saying you can cast Alter Self spell at will and you can cast it while you're in your Elemental Wild Shape. I think that would be more interesting. Is it going to massively change how the class is played? Absolutely not. But it would kind of build upon something previous and turn it into something interesting, I guess, would be the best way to say it. Yeah. So that is the Druid. So, final thoughts. Overall, again, the defining features of the Druid are Druidic, which never shows up anywhere ever. So if you wanted to build a subclass around Druidic, you would have to get real creative. You have Spellcasting and you have Wild Shape. Those are your two defining features that if you are creating a subclass, you need to find a way to incorporate at least one of those, or else the subclass is not going to work. This is what the class is built around. Things that we saw in here, finding different ways to use limited resources that already exist. The Druid has two different limited resources. You have your Spellcasting, which is a kind of universal 5th edition limited resource, and you have your Wild Shapes. We'll see in the next video. Using a charge of Wild Shape to do something different can be an extremely effective way to create an interesting homebrew. That being said, just changing how Wild Shape works, giving them different forms that they can use, giving them more powerful forms can be a really, really useful way to do this. Understand, though, the Circle of the Moon Druid already exists. If your entire purpose is, well, I want to create a Druid that can, you know, just do really, really awesome damage with Wild Shape, Circle of the Moon kind of covers that base for you. And again, the Druid is still a full spellcaster. If you build a subclass entirely around Wild Shape and forget that spellcasting exists, again, 18th level, they can cast spells in Wild Shape. You're going to have balance issues at 18th level. Always, 100%, that's what will happen if you completely ignore a defining feature. And even without that, a good example, a really powerful combo that I have seen Druids use, and I have to find the spell here real quick, because I'm going to, I think that's what it's called. Hold, please. There we go. Sunbeam. Sunbeam is a super useful spell. Druids get access to 6th level spells at 11th level. So the level after they get Elemental Wild Shape, they get their first 6th level spell. Sunbeam is a 6th level spell, which is concentration. When you cast Sunbeam, it takes an action. Your Wild Shape is a bonus action for Moon Druid. An incredibly common thing to do is you cast Sunbeam as your action, you blast them with the Sunbeam, and then you transform into an Earth Elemental, and you become literally Iron Man. Because you can go around, you can't fly, unfortunately, though if you transformed into a Wind Elemental, you could fly. But you go around, you just go, because because the concentration is already happening. Transforming into a wild shape doesn't break concentration. And this is something that a lot of druids will do, is they will cast a concentration spell before they wild shape, and then they have additional options. They can actually use their wild shape almost entirely for movement. Things like lightning, I think it's lightning storm or thunderstorm. Basically, you use it and it creates a storm, and then you can call down lightning bolts as your action going forward. If you do that on one turn, then your next turn you turn into something with a lot more movement, you can basically just run around not being able to be hit and continue using your action or however the spell works to keep doing damage while you are wild shaped. So understand, if you're only going to be focusing on wild shape, spellcasting still exists. Concentration spells still exist. You need to understand that whatever happens in wild shape, whatever they do before it, is going to affect that. Understand when you give them new forms, especially if you give them new forms of spellcasting abilities for whatever reason. That can backfire massively. Be very careful about that. And then don't forget, just because you are focusing on spellcasting, for instance, doesn't mean that every single feature has to be about spellcasting, or that every single feature has to specifically focus on a defining feature. The subclass should be tied to a defining feature in some way, but improving their movement can fit into your subclass just as well as giving them more spells, or making their spells more powerful, or making their spells not hit certain allies, or only hit enemies, or the things like that. Like, there's a lot of ways to modify spellcasting, but just as useful, giving them a new movement type, or giving them an ability to be immune to something that would stop them from spell casting. All of these things can be really, really useful ways to add abilities to your subclass that is going to make them more effective. And don't forget, when you are looking at the subclass, look at other subclasses and look at how often role-playing abilities or exploration abilities show up. If you are homebrewing something and every other subclass has a role-playing ability, and you put a combat ability, your class is going to be unbalanced, because specifically for combat, because every other subclass has a role-playing ability there. And for role-playing, you're going to be at a disadvantage, because every other subclass gets something they can use for role-playing, and you are limited to being useful in combat only. And a lot of people seem to miss out on that idea of, when you're homebrewing, you should be putting in some things for roleplay as well, because that's part of the game. There are 3 pillars of D&D. Most people ignore exploration, which sucks, because it's a really cool aspect of D&D. But understand it. For me personally, the exploration aspect is a lot more time-consuming to prep for than the other 2. And that's even with me being really bad at making maps. I still have an easier time making maps and designing combat encounters, both of which I'm not great at, than I do creating interesting exploration style for the things. So I can understand why people ignore that. But role-playing is a defining feature of RPGs. And if your subclass focuses entirely on combat, anytime you're not in combat, your character is going to become a silent protagonist that this story happens to them. They're not a part of it. And you don't want that. So understand, there should be some aspects that are more role-playing focused. And the easiest way to figure out where you should put those is look at other subclasses and see, okay, this is obviously a role-playing focused thing. Or this specific ability has role-playing aspects to it. I'm going to make sure that mine does that too. Those are really, really great ways to make sure that your homebrew feels balanced, and also that when people are using it, you're not forcing them to solve problems in only one way. If all your abilities are combat focused for your subclass, then you are effectively telling your player you need to solve every problem you have by attacking people. And that's not going to be fun for them. It's not going to be fun for the DM either, because anytime there's any bit of resistance, they're going to go, well, my entire subclass is built around killing things, so that's what I'm going to do. You don't want to give me the discount on the potion? All right, take this, fire elemental to the face. So yeah. Anyway, that is going to be all for me today. As always, if you enjoyed this, like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, turn notifications on in the comments down below. What are your thoughts on spellcasting and wild shape as far as defining features? Do you think the Druid should have different defining features? Do you think Druidic is as undervalued as I think it is? Let me know in comments down below. Otherwise, again, that is all for me today, and I'll see you guys next time, all right? Bye-bye.